Surviving the Survivor. We bring you the best guests in all of true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, Joel Waldman.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor. It is the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. And tonight you're in for a special treat with some powerhouse attorneys. We are discussing the Alexander brothers. There is Oren, Alon, and Tal. They're originally, the parents are from Israel. And one of the issues at this bail hearing today was possible flight to Israel. The headline here is bail was denied, but there is a lot to talk about, and we're going to get into the details and the minutia. But about a month has passed. It was December 11th that the three brothers were separately arrested in Miami, where I am. Today, there was a 3-hour hearing. Again, Judge Valerie Caproni, she is the U.S. District Judge presiding over the case. She said, after a 3-hour hearing, she said, this is not enough. We're going to tell you what the family offered up. This was a hearing for all three brothers at one time, which here in Miami, when they were in federal court and state court, in federal court, they were going separately. State court, Oren and Alon were together. The brothers are facing some very serious sex trafficking charges, including the drugging, and I don't say the word on YouTube, the R-ing of dozens of women. More than four, or at least 42 have come forward so far. And the crimes allegedly occurred over the span of 2 decades. Oh, and by the way, the SDNY, in a pre-hearing motion, they notified the court that they're in the possession of both photos and video of all three brothers in various stages of undress, presumably with some of the accused who also appear to be under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Without further ado, the best guests, and they're good ones tonight. Randy Zellen. He is a New York City-based former prosecutor turned criminal defense attorney with more than 30 years experience and has tried cases both against the DOJ and the SEC. He's also a teacher, an adjunct professor at Cornell Law, and he's all over your TV sets. He does Bloomberg, Fox, you name it, he's there. Ronald Richards, first-time best guest. Thank you for being here. He is a LA-based criminal defense attorney with an office in D.C. where he practices as well, doing criminal defense and civil litigation. He's also big in the media, national media spotlight. He has worked as a professor at the of law at the San Fernando Valley College of Law, and has even sat as a temporary judge on the Los Angeles Superior Court. And last but not least, one of our favorites, this guy is an acting DA out of Tennessee, General Mark Davidson. He started in the business right after law school in 94. He returned to the district attorney's office in 2011, where he was at, and then elected district attorney general, hence the name General Mark, in August of 2018. So we're going to dive right into this. But before we do, I just want to say I've had a bunch of people reach out to me on Instagram. It's at Surviving the Survivor. If anyone, either an alleged victim or someone who just wants to speak out on this case, and I'm based in Miami Beach, basically a stone's throw from where a lot of this happened. So people have been coming to me. If anyone needs or wants a platform, Surviving the Survivor is open to you. You can hit me up on Instagram at Surviving the Survivor, or send us an email, survivingthesurvivor@gmail.com, and we can keep you anonymous on air. Even we even have the capability to adjust voices so voices cannot be recognized, because I know this is really sensitive stuff. But that's it. Randy Zellen, I mean, first and most obvious question. I mean, prognosticators were saying, no way these guys are getting out on bail. We saw it with Diddy, saw it with Jeffrey Epstein. They're in the same district in New York. Are you surprised in any way that the judge told him to basically get lost and stay behind bars?
I'm not surprised. I guess I would say that I am a bit disappointed. I think that we've all become so jaded to this notion of, in particular, people with money automatically presumed to being a flight risk. Now, when we're talking about federal law works a bit differently than a lot of state law. In federal law, a judge looks at two things. Are you a flight risk? And are you a danger to the community or anyone in the community? It's a two-pronged test. Now, where the Alexander brothers ran into a problem the same way Diddy ran into a problem is that even though there's a presumption, you're presumed innocent. And under federal law, there really is a presumption that you should be released, that the judge surely can find some condition or some combination of conditions to let you go home. Again, you have been found guilty of nothing. You're presumed innocent. The problem for the Alexander brothers is that there are certain crimes where, for example, the upward end of your sentence is life, or you're looking at a minimum mandatory sentence, or it's a sex crime or a crime of violence. That presumption flips. It's no longer a presumption that you should be out on the street. There really is a presumption that you should be locked up. And that is the problem that the Alexander brothers ran into when they learned the hard way. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You ain't going anywhere. So now they are guests, presumably, at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn.
I have a feeling that General Mark might be the fan favorite tonight as an active prosecutor. But Ronald, to you, I was surprised to find out that the brothers are actually still being detained in Miami, all three of them. So they were not at the bail hearing. I mean, from a constitutional standpoint, would you have made any kind of uproar or issue over the fact that the brothers themselves couldn't be there at their own hearing because they're still detained in Miami?
Well, as you know, I've been covering this extensively and posting the pleadings and dealing with this.
Ronald, please give everyone your Instagram because Ronald puts out great info.
It's at Attorney Ronald Richards. Okay. And it's just one of the cases that we're covering. We covered on Instagram and on X. It's at Ronald Richards. But this was an unusual strategy by the lawyers. So I just have to dip back to understand, so everyone understands what happened here. There was a state case, and they posted a very large bail in state court, which then allowed the federal agents to grab them from the state court and take them to the federal court. They were arrested initially in state custody. They then delayed their transfers to the federal court, especially the first brother, Tal, that had his bail hearing denied first, because it was just easier for them to meet with the Miami lawyers. One of their lawyers had a sight problem, and they did all sorts of things that I don't ever recommend defendants do. Like, they bothered the federal judge on Christmas Eve and said, "Can you stay our removal order?" And the judges, in my colleague that's in the Southern District could tell you that they don't like to be, when you start doing things out of the norm and you start asking judges for favors, and it's the worst thing you could possibly do. But the problem is that these lawyers had relationships with these defendants, and they couldn't tell them, "Shut up, wait, let us get some evidence, so we're not just getting bombarded with allegations that we don't know how to refute them." So the defendants were screaming, "We got to get out, we got to get out." And so they waived their appearance at this hearing today. So there is no constitutional issue. And the judge even commented at the beginning of the hearing, which I have the transcript, I don't never have bail hearings without the defendants, but because they insisted, because they didn't want to go to Oklahoma, you guys have all seen the Nicolas Cage movie Con Air. They didn't want to go to Oklahoma. They didn't want to just deal with the transport. So they figured they'd sit in Miami. Their wives are there. It's more comfortable. And they'll all go after the bail hearing, which, again, it's like this privileged type of thing that in the background, no one would say it, but the lawyers, who are all seasoned defense attorneys, they kind of let the clients run the show because they showed up with a polygraph. like these typical games defense attorneys love to do. And the judge said that polygraph's never going to see the light of day. The response from the Miami lawyer was, well, it was taken in front of former federal agents, like anybody cares. And like the judge is like, they could just walk out, and the problem with a New York judge that's seen everything. I mean, you got to realize they've literally seen everything. She just wasn't moving. And then, the well-known Miami lawyer that was arguing said, well, in one of the videos, she stood up after she was allegedly assaulted. And the judge is like, if that's your argument, you lose. So there was crazy arguments that I got to, and again, as a defense attorney, you got to do what the client wants. Sometimes, as long as it's legal and not ethical. And I get it. They wanted to get out. But many times I've told clients to stay pat so we can get some friggin' discovery. So I can show that the allegations are a joke. So these guys literally went in to the most well-heeled prosecution unit in the world and got their butts kicked because they're not from New York City. They don't really practice there. I've been in these courts as an outsider. It's a different type of gestalt. And when you're going in with no facts, the judge even commented to the Miami lawyer, you sound like such a defense attorney. And the guy said, I am a defense attorney. I started at Harvard as the defenders. But all of this doesn't mean anything because then the judges figures they're paid mouthpieces. And unfortunately, with no defendants there, a bunch of agents that used to work for the government saying, we're going to watch them. And then the government laying out 20 years of assaults in these horrific WhatsApp messages where they're talking about what drugs they're going to give the women so they could score with them. That's going to be enough in this type of case. And then they made a lot of technical arguments, that you really can't have a federal statute because you bring the victim from New York to New Jersey in an Uber. I mean, I read all the papers. Again, they were good papers. They really were with what they had, but they put themselves in a horrible position because now the judge has made the final nail in the coffin, and it's highly unlikely. And my colleague could, weigh in if he disagrees. I doubt it that the Second Circuit's going to release 3 alleged sex offenders before trial. It's not like you get a lot of love in the Second Circuit. So
that's why, to your point, they would have been better served waiving the hearing right now without prejudice, meaning they can bring it again, not having a full-blown detention hearing, getting the discovery, and actually being able to deal with really the issue of are they truly a danger and how real are these allegations? How provable are they? And then start poking some holes there. But to go in half-assed because the client says, I want to get the hell out of here, was an ill-advised move.
Yeah, and I would point out that, they had foreign-born wives. They have foreign properties. It's like an easy target shooting for the prosecutor. But what my colleague would agree with me, they want to get hired. So you go in and see someone in jail, and all they want to talk about is how do I get out? And many times, I have family members say, will you go down and visit my relative in jail? I said, no, because I'm not running a bail motion. They're not going to get out. So if you want someone to go give you a bunch of nonsense, hire them. I want to focus on the merits, and we'll talk about bail in 60 days when I got some facts to work with. But a lot of lawyers, they want the money, they want the retainer, and they just can't say no to the client, which is unfortunate because that's what the client really needs to hear is someone that's not scared of detention. That's why you have an impartial person that's supposed to be giving you advice, but it doesn't always work that way in practice.
Yeah, by the way, you shouldn't be bugging judges on Christmas Eve.
It was horrible.
Yeah,
horrible.
especially if you're 3 Jewish brothers, you should know better. Julia Rock here. Did the one brother's wife give birth? Oren tried to get out for her to give birth. She did give birth. From what I understand, they've all got young children, like infant children. One of the wives has taken off to Brazil, and the other ones are basically in hiding now. And I got to tell you, I feel for them. Quite a bit because their lives are turned absolutely upside down. To the general, Mark Davidson, by the way, from what I understand, they had the brothers have both New York and defense teams. There's a woman named Deanna Paul. with a firm called Walden, Mack, Harron, and Williams. I believe that's a New York City firm.
Jim Walden is running for mayor.
Oh, there you go. Well, there you go. It's going to be interesting against Eric Adams. So anyway, Alon and Tal are represented in part by Howard Shrebnick down here and a guy named Milt Williams. And then there's a guy named Richard Clue, who is actually also he's defending Oren Alexander. So and Shrebnick's the one that kind of had to walk things back because he basically, when I asked him a question down here in federal court, he said that all the accusers are lying. And I think he had to kind of walk that back.
Victim shaming, as the general will tell us from a prosecutorial standpoint, it's not the strategy.
Yeah, I mean, Randy, you would never do that. You would just say my clients are innocent, correct? But you wouldn't say they're all lying.
Well, I would go slightly further than my clients are innocent, and I probably would stay away from that because, quite frankly, the innocent prong for purposes of do your clients go out the door that you came in or do they go out the side door back with the marshals hinges a lot more, again, on the danger component and the flight risk component. When you look at all of the factors, the question of the strength of the evidence from a guilt standpoint, it's only one of a bunch. So no, you focus in on my clients are not going anywhere. So you pack the courtroom with family. You have the wives there. You have the clients there. You allow the judge to put a face, add a human element to what you're talking. That was a huge mistake not to have them in the courtroom. And you talk about them not being a danger, not being a flight risk, and you put all of these conditions as far as a bail package goes. But again, as I know the general will talk about, you have to also deal, as I said, you do have to deal with the evidence. So that's why you don't go in half-assed. You tell the clients, chill out, let me get some discovery, let me get some proof so we can show the judge that this case is not what it appears to be.
Yeah. By the way, there's a lot to go through tonight, so I hope the best guest will stick around. But we've got photos and video to talk about. There was even a polygraph test that was administered to Oren, so we're going to go over that as well. Why that was brought in. La Mesa Filipino Food Club here. Anyone know if these alleged pigs are still being called boys? That's a reference also when Howard Shrebnick was basically victim shaming. He was referring to his client the three brothers as boys, and people did not take kindly to that. So finally on to the general. It's been gotten a word in yet, General. I apologize, but my first question is, do you agree with Randy on his first point that they're making too big a deal about a flight risk? I mean, these guys are literally, the family's worth hundreds of millions. They've got family in Israel, family in Brazil. Not that hard, at least in Miami, to get on a boat, get to Cuba or something and get out of Dodge. So is Randy making a good point, or do you, as a prosecutor, are you saying these guys have got to stay put behind bars till we go to trial?
Well, I will first say that it sounds like the Alexanders should have hired Ronald and Randy to represent them.
Yeah, I would.
That would have been a good start, a better start than what they have. Yes, of course, I'm going to say that the judge correctly concluded that they do present a flight risk. I understand that their means and resources and wealth arguably should not be a consideration, but when you start talking about flight risk, it's almost impossible to make that determination without considering that. And then you look at the fact that they're from Israel. One of the wives apparently is in Brazil. They're multinational. They have the capacity to travel easily. We saw this in the Adelson case in Florida when Donna attempted to board a plane to Vietnam. And I completely agree with Randy and Ronald that, what they did in New York in that hearing was kind of the "you ain't from here" presentation, which doesn't go well.
Be like me showing up in Memphis.
Yeah, or Dan Rashbaum, Mark, showing up in Tallahassee.
Right, and now in Memphis judges, if you're a Nashville lawyer showing up in Memphis, to argue something, and you tell the judge, Judge, I'm here today from Nashville, you're likely to get well, I don't know how y'all do it in Nashville, but this is how we do it around here in Memphis. And you're going from Miami to New York. Your clients are sitting in Miami. It really could not have gone any worse, but it went the way it should have. They are a danger. The prosecution has alleged in its detention letters some 10 victims per defendant, with recently discovered video and other evidence and a search warrant raid on one of their apartments. It sounds to me like the proof in this case is going to be very strong. Multiple victims. Accusing them of being all liars is not going to fly with a jury. That's a terrible defense. And so from this perspective, my perspective, it looks like the prosecution has a very strong case in multiple locations. They've got the judge on their side with detention. And I think these defendants, not boys, but defendants, are going to be sitting in trial or sitting in jail waiting for their trial.
Yeah, and by the way, Alon and Oren, 37 years old. Tal Alexander, the older one, 38 years old. By the way, we've got a lot of graphic elements. However, the COE, Ronald, that's the chief of everything, a.k.a. my wife, she is stuck in Miami traffic. Now, as a guy who grew up in New Jersey, lived a lot of years in New York City, and is now living in Miami, I can tell you firsthand that when a guy like Howard Shrebnick shows up in New York City, they're looking at him like a flashy Miami defense attorney, maybe a little bit of arrogance. And so I agree with all three of these panelists that maybe they should have hired Ronald and Randy. Randy for sure, because he's up in New York. But Randy, this is an interesting point. They have lawyers that are yes men. How careful do you have to be to not fall into that trap, especially with high-profile criminal defendants? And secondly, they do have lawyers in New York and in Miami. It seems kind of complicated, or another hurdle in terms of kind of coalescing, coming up with game plans. So how do they do that?
Well, working backwards to both the general and Ronald's point, when you are a foreigner in a foreign land, you are a Florida lawyer coming to the Southern District of New York, you bring in your local Southern District counsel, and you basically sit there and keep your mouth shut. And you let the Southern District lawyers do the argument. You want to pass some notes. You want to talk during the break, but you should let the people who are in that courtroom day in and day out handle the arguments. That's number one. Number two, if you are someone used to handling high-profile cases, you're not a yes lawyer, because you recognize that you are one high-profile case away from not having any more high-profile cases. Because when you look so foolish with 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycles, that gets remembered. And lawyers in the community remember it, and maybe the public remembers it. It's simply not worth it. Unless this is your last case and you're planning on retiring, you don't want to be a yes person for anyone. And you don't want to walk into a courtroom and get your head handed to you. Sure, you may lose, and you may lose more often than you win, but that's a relative thing. And sometimes winning is living to fight another day. So what you do is, if you're not ready to make a fulsome bail application, come in with a fulsome bail package that is not going to get laughed out of the courtroom, and you have time to prepare, and you deal with the things that, for example, the general raised, having unlimited means, multinational. Well, I would walk in there with a copy of the extradition treaty with Israel, and I would be prepared to talk about it and explain that, given the nature of these charges, if they were stupid enough to flee to Israel, they're going to be sent right back, and then they're never getting out. Same thing with Brazil. Be prepared to talk about the extradition treaty and how Brazil treats people accused of sex crimes who flee the jurisdiction. Shut the planes down, shut the computers down, have 24/7 lockdown. They're going to be basically on house arrest. There are so many things that you can do to at least put your best foot forward. Sometimes that requires you to say to a client, as Ronald said, no, we're not doing the hearing today. There is a presumption that you should be detained because you're looking at life, because you're looking at a 15-year minimum mandatory, because this is a sex trafficking case. It is a crime of violence. So shut up, relax, because once there's a final order of detention entered by the district judge, again, as Ronald said, you now have to go to the Second Circuit. They ain't letting you out. So let's wait until we're actually ready instead of doing this and getting our heads handed to us, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah. By the way, Ronald, I did have a note, and I kind of just looked over it, and my apologies, but I was going to ask you, how are you doing in LA? You know, I know you're, I believe, in the Beverly Hills area, which I don't think was affected in terms of home damage, but how's it been the last week or so for you?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. It's not really about me per se, because the fires were all around Beverly Hills, but the gravity of the devastation is beyond anything anybody could appreciate. It's like it'd be like losing Queens in New York City, the entire Queens. Like, it's a large area that people may not appreciate how big the scope is. And, you know, judges were showing up in court last week, and lawyers are sending, you know, many emails. I lost my home. I lost my home. I lost my home. So it's not like there's not a person I know that doesn't know somebody, like multiple people that have lost their homes. So it is a problem, you know, and even the one or two houses that would survive on a street, how are you going to go back to that street? There's going to be construction for years. There's chemicals in the air. You got to walk around with an N95 mask because of carcinogens in the air, but you don't really want to go outside. But it is hopefully LA will recover from it, but I appreciate you asking.
Yeah. By the way, photo on the right, and I'm glad to hear that, Ronald. That's Oren, I believe, on the right. They're twins, tough to tell apart. And then that's Tal on the left in the brownish beige suit. And then you see all three of them up top, and they're with their father. By the way, so many people have asked me, like, how did 3 brothers out of 4 brothers in one family end up like this? And so next week, we're actually going to bring on psychologists and experts in the field who study sexual predators, and we're going to ask them what happened here, what's going on. It's in that sense, it is extremely odd.
Well, just so you know, that in the Miami community, their relationships with women was not a secret. You know, I happen to be very close to the Jewish community in Miami. Their parents are very successful. We have a lot of mutual friends. They're very nice people, their parents. I mean, what happened here, you got to look at what years ago where conduct was never investigated in a civil way, then became investigated in a civil way, and a lot of conduct that went overlooked or unreported. You know, the Southern District of New York has transmogrified that conduct into criminal conduct. And so what, you know, some of their arguments that they're married now, they have kids, they did bring up the extradition issues in Israel, but you can't do this without evidence. But their conduct, you know, was well known in Miami. You know, the trips, the sort of amount of partners they had. This was, but if you ask on a simple level for the audience, it's very rare that 3 brothers have coordinated text messages that over document the delivery of narcotics, especially GHB, to women. I mean, you know, in LA, I've represented very wealthy men that have been charged with rape by intoxication crimes. I think I did one of the most well-known cases in LA history was the limousine rapist. You know, we would pick girls up at clubs and give them cocaine and gin and juice was the drink back then. And he was ultimately acquitted because a lot of the women, you know, had a financial motive. But again, that the conduct in this case, there was no text messages back then. I mean, the conduct in this case is, unfortunately for them, very documented, and it reads really bad, the evidence. And then they leave videos on a hard drive which shows confused women. And in this day and age, if you're rich and you're documenting giving girls date rape drugs, and GHB, I will tell you, people do take it to have sex. It's not like everyone takes it to rape people. However, when you're doing it, when you're having text messages saying we got to bring G, not bring marijuana, because the G is easier to intoxicate them, like the messages are geared toward conquesting women or achieving, sex with them, and then you get charged with a crime, you really can't walk back from this stuff. So that's why they're having, that's why that's why they're in this problem, because it went beyond a normal scale. And sometimes I tell clients, you're indicted because your conduct is, whether it's criminal or not, is so abnormal and so aberrant that the prosecutor can't really tell. And then you have all these victims saying that you did this wrong. You're not going to convince anybody that that it was consensual or that somehow there's a misunderstanding. You're just going to have to chill out and wait a little bit so we can really see how this pans out. And so that's why this case is highly unusual, because it's three brothers. I mean, most people don't have a relationship with their brother that's centered around taking girls on trips to sleep with them. I mean, really, I can't think of a prior case, and I don't know if Randy can, where you had this type of familiar coordination where where the brothers plan trips so they can sleep with girls. I know plenty of
which by the way, Ronald, in some instances the brothers were not with each other, but together with a woman, which is also incredibly, in my opinion, very disturbing. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, the woman could be, a lot of these people have a woman to sort of tone down and lower the apprehension if they're trying to accomplish sex with another woman. But all I'm saying is that in this particular case, that it's just unusual that they all three sort of, this was their like entertainment. I've had, again, in Los Angeles, there's certain pockets of the city in gated communities where, people have these quote modeling parties. You come here and you can be a model, and then it's all a ruse just to have girls. Like there's all sorts of ruses, but they don't rise to the level of, it's a criminal ruse. It's like, hey, we're going to have all sorts of things that young women may be interested in, but you're going to sign a waiver. You're going to say you're not doing drugs. I mean, there's a way to do this where it is adults just acting like adults. But in this case, it went way beyond a case study that I've ever seen, where you document with other people, not even, your family, about we're going to get girls on trips and intentionally give them illicit drugs, cross state lines, cross international boundaries. That's why we're here. And then, there is some similarities with the Sean Combs case, because again, he was notorious. He had a house 2 blocks away from me. I would run into him 3 or 4 times over the summer when he'd be in LA, or the winter. He'd drive a nice car. I'd see him coming up the street and wave. He was very close to my house in a nice neighborhood, and his parties were notorious. And it was just that, and you would wonder, when is this all going to bounce back? Because other celebrities like Justin Bieber never had a problem. And that's because he always had people around him. If you were a young girl and wanted to talk to him, the security make you sign a waiver, your driver's license, a photo, and you weren't going to get near him. Okay, they were called handlers. But these guys really lost their way. And whether they're criminally liable or not, they are, morally stupid to do all this and have all these messages documenting what they're doing. Because it's illegal to distribute drugs, even if you're not charging for it. And a criminal lawyer would know that. You never give other people drugs. That is like the death knell of social behavior. Let them get their own drugs.
By the way, it also creates the element of the commercial sex act, because
Correct.
you are giving something of value in exchange for the sex, which is a critical element of sex trafficking.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
By the way,
I
contrary to some of the things that Ronald has heard, I've heard, and I need to be careful, obviously, but I've heard other stories about the father and the mother that are not quite as flattering. But I've never been inside the walls of those homes, and I'll leave that to other people to sort of tend to that issue. But Mark, to you, the general, there's a guy named Ohad Fisherman. He happens to live in my beloved mother's building here in Miami Beach. At first, he was reported as being a cousin. He's a friend. He only faces state charges. He was able to get bail. He's, in his condo somewhere not far from my mother with an ankle bracelet on. He, too, just got married. He has young kids, just got back from Tokyo. That's when he was taken into custody and since then released. But the reason I'm bringing him up, on the videos, you see other men, other potential defendants. My question to you is, are we going to see other defendants? What's going on behind the scenes now with prosecutors? Are they leaning on all these guys, trying to get as much as they can to just seal the deal when it comes to the three brothers?
I would think there's a very strong likelihood that's exactly what's happening here. And you're likely to see this in the Diddy case, where people who want to stay out of the sights of the prosecution decide better to be a witness than a defendant. There's probably going to be, just as Randy and Ronald have talked about, you got text messaging, you got social media evidence, you have video evidence, you have photographs. You're going to have other people involved in setting these things up and procuring drugs and doing all these things necessary to commit these kind of multi-state, federal level commercial sex trafficking. So I would fully expect to see the feds leaning on quasi-defendants to become witnesses and taking multiple proffers to see the value of those witnesses and what might be valuable to them at trial or not.
And particularly with the nature of the charges, Joel, because with these charges, these defendants are looking at minimum mandatory sentences. So when you were talking about a minimum mandatory sentence and taking a step back, when you're talking about federal criminal offense conduct, it's a number crunching game. The sentencing guidelines, which is what dictates the amount of time that a defendant is going to get, is all based upon mathematics. Every crime that someone commits, attach points to it. What someone does in furtherance of the crime, attach points to it. You add up the points, sometimes you get to subtract, and you go to a chart. And that chart has a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. The horizontal axis is your criminal history. You ever been in trouble before? All the way out to the end, you're a career criminal. The vertical axis, the number of points you have. So 43 is the most, and you look at the chart and you look at the intersection, and that's the time that you're looking at in months. But when you're talking about a minimum mandatory sentence, and here, the minimum mandatory sentence is 180 months. The guidelines are now advisory. They used to be mandatory, but they're not advisory when it comes to minimum mandatories. The only way that a judge is unshackled from giving a defendant the minimum mandatory is when the defendant cooperates, because that's when the government goes to the judge, makes a motion, and says, Judge, don't worry about the minimum mandatory sentencing. Here's our motion. This defendant cooperated with us, helped us prosecute others. Forget about minimum mandatories. So you're going to have people not lining up. They've already lined up. They were probably lined up before the Alexander brothers got arrested, all in an effort to avoid, at the very least, a minimum mandatory sentence, which the Alexander brothers themselves are now looking at. And unless one of them's planning on turning on the others, or there's something we don't know about where they're all going to turn on someone else, it is highly unlikely that if we were talking about musical chairs, that the music stops and there's any place for the Alexander brothers to sit that's going to give them any degree of comfort that they're not going to be spending, at the very least, the next 180 months, less whatever credit they may be able to get for good time in jail.
Coco here, wondering how did this come to light? Just so you know, here in Miami, and I was talking to some friends today, this has been an open secret, if you will, for 20 years. People knew, and no one really acted, but 4 civil lawsuits were filed over the summer, and then a flood of women accusing them came forward. Again, that number's over 42 women. So these brothers also, to Randy's point earlier, have never faced any criminal charges. They've been squeaky clean up to now, again, with the caveat that this has been an open secret that they've been doing this. And I have to tell you, I have not come across a single person, and I've talked to probably 50, maybe 100 people about this, who've had anything good to say about these guys. And that tells you something. So Ronald, let me go back to you, and then I want to get into the offerings for the bail. But there's a question earlier, very simple question. You've got the accusers; they're going to testify, which we'll get to. A lot of them. You've got video, digital evidence, text messages. When you get hired for this, Ronald, what is your defense? Because I'm not a trained lawyer, and I'm thinking, don't hire me because I have no idea what I'm going to tell people, because it's looking real bad for you.
So what's the question?
The question is, how do you come up with a defense for these guys with their backs glued to the wall right now?
Well, it's a miserable position, because when they're detained, I mean, the lawyer in Miami, what's he going to do now? Live in Brooklyn and drive to MDC every day? I mean, it's, you become the de facto therapist, because you don't, the family can only visit you once every week, maybe. They have limited minutes on their calls, and then, the client will blow up your email and phone to come visit because they have nothing else to do. So I probably would never take a case like this, just because you're just it's going to consume your entire office, and the money just wouldn't be worth it. But the defense,
what about the, sorry to interrupt, but what about the high profile nature? Would you want that shine on you? But you heard Randy say, you have one high profile criminal case. If you butcher it, that might be your last one.
Well, I don't know I don't necessarily know about that, only to the extent that Srebnick represented Avenatti and got scorched in trial in the Southern District. And but he did a good job. Srebnick, I thought, gave Avenatti a hell of a defense, and you're representing a fellow lawyer. But he's lost a lot of cases. I mean, I have, good defense attorneys lose cases. I mean, you got to try the cases. I don't think Randy meant that if you get a high profile case and you lose, but you did a good job, that's going to hurt you. I think that what happened here, from other lawyers that are watching this, that know what they're doing, we're wondering, okay, so your client wants to get out, at least wait till they get there. I totally agree. The judge, emotionally, optically, there's no defendant there. She could be really kind of jerky and doesn't care. There's no decorum. They're just lawyers. Judges don't have to be super, nice to lawyers. We have thick skin. But when there's a defendant there, the judges, I would say, a little bit more reserved. So that's why I just find this was a mistake of colossal proportions. I said it over and over again when they were rushing the Miami detention hearings. But to put a defense together, we had this problem in the Gordon Jones case, in other cases where they put the defendant on TV and then everybody comes forward. I mean, what a common defense, and I'm sure Randy will agree, is you go for the low-hanging fruit. The government's not perfect. Not all, just because you're a quote victim doesn't mean you're a truth teller. Not every victim tells the truth. Let's be realistic. So you find the first victim, let's say there's 40 victims, because, you know, sometimes they go overboard. There was 2 in the indictment, but there's 40 victims. So you get the discovery and you find that the 5 worst victims that really are not telling the truth. And then you kind of focus on them. And there's an expression, you know, one bad apple could spoil the barrel. So what you do is you focus on that. You try to cobble together some inconsistencies. You maybe see that the agents made a mistake, but you say they lied in an affidavit. You know, they'll say it was a mistake. You use maybe a more polite word. They were inaccurate, but you can't do anything until you know the evidence. This is why this poker game, when you're playing with people's lives, I really would have expected an experienced lawyer to say, no, I'm not doing the bail hearing. I have no discovery, and we're going to lose.
Unfortunately, to Ronald's point, and Mark will appreciate this as a prosecutor, what a client doesn't want to hear is oftentimes the only thing to be told to a client, which is, as a defendant in a high-profile case like this, you've got to be patient. You've got to let things settle down. You've got to let someone else become the soup du jour. Let someone else. Does anybody remember Luigi Mangione now?
Yeah.
No.
And what will happen is a few weeks from now, something else will happen, and no one will remember the Alexander brothers. So what they need to do is they need to be patient, because what you want to hope for in a case like this is, to Ronald's point, people, these women, they move on with their lives. And now all of a sudden they start getting phone calls from agents and prosecutors. Hey, we need you to come in. We need you to start prepping. You're like, wait a minute. I have to live this again. I have to get on a witness stand and talk about all this. I've moved on with my life. I have new relationships. Maybe I've gotten married. Maybe I have kids now. I don't want this anymore. This is not a part of my life I want to revisit. And you almost have to hope that victims start dropping out. And to Ronald's point, maybe you do find some inconsistencies. Maybe this issue of a lack of consent, maybe it's not a complete lack of consent. And then you find a little bit of a thread to pull on, and now you start making people nervous. Does that mean you're getting a dismissal and an apology? No. Does it mean maybe you can avoid a minimum mandatory 180-year sentence? Sometimes that's the measure of a victory here, where you can position your client where your client is not looking at spending the next 20, 30 years in jail. And by the way, in a case like this, they're not going to a prison camp. They're not going to be living in what appears to and feels like a motel where they're sleeping in bunk beds and having a grand old time of it. They're going to end up in a real jail, maybe with some other bunkmates who are not going to be real thrilled that these white Jewish kids with lots of money decide to go raping women. And maybe they should get a taste of their own medicine. There are ways of dealing with people like the Alexander brothers in a real prison setting. So, hey, victories, wins, it really is a relative thing here.
To follow up with what Randy said, I just want to make a point to expand on that. You know, I represented a New York Indian designer in LA, and he flew girls to LA because he had like a scam to then just try to sleep with them, pretend he was going to put them in different design things. And there's a lot of abuse in that industry. And I got him like an 8-year offer early on. I said, they're going to come out of the woodwork. They're going to charge you in New York, in Texas. We got to wrap this up and apply double jeopardy. So I do a global, basically broad factual plea. And the family was like, are you nuts? I'm not doing an 8-year deal. I'm like, but we have draconian sentences in California. He can get 65 years to life. And if you force all these girls to come, the prosecutor doesn't want to make them all go through it again, exactly what Randy said. And sometimes, you have that going for you, and you can get a sort of where you can still have a life. And he said no. Some good colleagues of mine gave him a hell of a trial, but he only won half the count. So on the half that he lost, the judge gave him 65 years. He's still in custody because the judge had no choice.
Is a lot better than missing 65 Hanukkahs.
Yeah. I gotta get Mark in here.
Mark, talk about plea bargaining. And sometimes it's good. You make a single digit deal early, right?
Yeah. There's always a window, right? From initial charging through discovery. If you take the advice of Ronald and Randy and lay low, get your evidence together, get your discovery, do some work, let the media wave kind of roll over you, and hopefully move on to the next case. There's a pretty decent window there where you can attempt to try to see how bad your position is with the state, what your options are, and if your options are horrible, which they're going to be for these three defendants, is there any eking out something that you can live with? 8 years is not going to happen in this case, but Ronald's right. There could be something less than life for one of these defendants if they want to, pull a Sammy the Bull Gravano move and try to salvage what little they have left out there. Now, the feds are not going to, there won't be a Sammy the Bull Gravano witness in this case, I don't believe.
I think there's, by the way, a mandatory minimum 15, but they could all serve life in prison, which is where I think it might be headed.
Right. And that's 15 at 100 is better than life.
Yep,
So,
that's for sure. Mark, I have another follow-up for you.
Sure.
We'll get back to this one. Would either the defense attorneys encourage one of the brothers to flip on the other? They're very tight with each other, so I don't know. That's like in the Adelson case. By the way, Dr. J, who went to law school, he's in the chat. He went to, not to law school, went to dental school with Charlie Adelson, and said that he used to see the Alexander brothers at a club called Mint, M-Y-N-T. So that's 1 degree of true crime separation right there. But the bail offering, and got a lot to cover, and it's Ronald's first time, so I hope he's okay sticking around for a little bit. But the brothers put up, in essence, more than $100 million per brother. That's what they were willing to put up. They proposed at today's hearing that they would put themselves, since they're still in Miami, in a high-rise condo. They said they have friends who would let them stay there, and claim that these aren't like super high-end buildings, where they would remain separately, and they would be guarded by private security, presumably paid for by them, which for me makes me a little bit nervous, because you're the guys paying them. Now I'm going to pay you a little extra to get me out of here. This, by the way, happened, all these crimes allegedly happened in New York, Miami, but it goes out to Aspen, the Hamptons, you name it. It covers a lot of terrain. And so these victims, in my opinion, are certainly not conspiring. A lot of them don't know each other. They just, I think after these 4 civil lawsuits were filed, felt okay coming forward. But Mark Davidson, to you, in Tennessee, you've got 5 rural counties. I assume you probably never had someone come in offering $100 million a defendant. But in this case, would the judge still tell them to go get lost?
Yes. We do occasionally have defendants who commit crimes across multiple counties in our area who do have resources. But what the judge is looking at here is the scope and the scale and the seriousness of the charges, and the fact that it's coordinated and it took place over decades. And you still have the threat of witness tampering, which we saw in the Diddy case. You let these guys out and put them in an environment that they pretty much control with their own selected security and whatnot. That still creates a possibility of harm and influence and tampering. And it looked to me like the judge in this case was just not going to put up with any of that, and was not favorably inclined towards any of the bail offerings that the defendants made, despite the large number amount. And we saw that in the Diddy case as well. So, and I'm looking at what you just put up here.
Yeah. I'm going to come to. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mark. This is obviously an exchange between Tal's attorney.
Yeah.
Let me read it out loud because a lot of people listen to the podcast. Judge Valerie Caproni, by the way, she does not look like she messes around. Video shows sex with women incapacitated. Isn't that the R word? The judge asks. Tal's second attorney says intoxicated. And then this is Richard Clue, this photo of this person. He was in a Miami federal courthouse. I'm sure he's an excellent defense attorney. He was coming off eye surgery, and he was having a little bit of a hard time getting his bearings straight. But he says the video we heard about today, Randy Zellin, the woman stood up immediately after having sex. She was not incapacitated. It is absurd. The judge then says, you are free to be as dramatic as you want. The prosecutors have talked with these witnesses. They say something was in the drink. Sounds like a date, you know what, drug that remains to be seen at trial. Judge is tough. And for him to just say it's absurd. And again, the interesting thing, and Ronald brought this up, and I don't think a lot of people realize this. The SDNY responded saying, we've got video, we've got photos, we've got text messages. But Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, the defense hasn't seen any of that yet. So he's arguing about something on video that he's never seen. So that's another problem.
Sure. And both Ronald and Mark have raised great points. Again, there's no discovery. Federal discovery works very differently than, for example, New York State discovery with bail reform. With bail reform in New York in a local case, you basically just wait for a prosecutor to back up a dump truck with all of the discovery. You don't have to ask for it. In a federal case, you still have to ask for it. You still get very little. And it really is a matter of you having a good relationship with the prosecutors where they're willing to give you over and above what the rules say you're entitled to in an effort, quite frankly, if they know you to be a trial lawyer, they want to dissuade you from going to trial. So they're very happy to sit in a conference room and say, hey, Randy, what do you want to see? In an effort to persuade me that me going to trial is a fool's errand. But the mistake here, this was a detention hearing. The issue was talking about release. And the rule is there a condition or combination of conditions to make the judge comfortable that the defendant will come to court when he's supposed to, and he will not be a danger to the community or anyone in the community. And to get into the weeds about a video and say, but wait a minute, judge, come on. She wasn't intoxicated. She stood right up. I mean, hello?
Yeah.
That is not going to get you anywhere. In fact, what you really want to do is say, judge, this is not the trial. And quite frankly, I haven't had the opportunity to review any of this. So to Ronald's point, you probably don't want to be doing the detention hearing until you've had an opportunity to take a look at that evidence so you can actually determine how you want to approach it. But if you want to go in there before you're ready, so don't focus in and draw more attention to it. What you want to do is create a diversion, create a distraction, say, Your Honor, the government is looking to try this case. And I'm not here to try this case. In fact, it's not fair. I haven't even gotten any discovery yet. We're here to talk about, does this court have to be concerned about my client taking off or being a danger to anyone? And that's what I'd like to focus the court's attention in and bring the court back to the fact that they were born here, they live here, they have families here. Yes, with all of their means, they're not going anywhere. Hopefully you can argue that maybe some of this offense conduct is quite old. They're not the same people back then. If it's true, then they are now. They're married, they have children, and use their means to their advantage. Judge, they have the means to show you that they're not going to destroy their lives by taking off, because they know if they take off, they can never, ever come back. They're not going to see their wives again. They're not going to see their children again, their parents again. And if, God forbid, they get caught, then they're really screwed. And to the extent that your audience is laughing at these arguments, that's why sometimes you want to hold off on making any arguments until you've had an opportunity to take a look at the discovery.
Yeah, and I know just intuitively that these guys, with the upbringing they have, do not want to be held behind bars in any way. I mean, Mark, Donna Adelson's obviously struggling herself in the Tallahassee courthouse. This is interesting. Larissa Harris, based on my history with the brothers, they're not the brightest. They better keep their mouth shut in prison. I've had former inmates on. They say they're going to be targets in prison if they get there. And if there's a trial, if they're convicted, if there's a plea deal, either which way. And they also said that they're going to be extorted, and not only they, but the parents will ultimately get extorted. So this is obviously a horrific situation for the victims, a horrible situation for the wives and these new infant children. Imagine being brought into the world, and this is how you're being set up. And then, these guys just appear to have self-destructed and ruined their entire lives. And that's why we're going to get on some of these experts on sexual predators, because I'm curious, as the son of a psychiatrist, why and what went wrong here. I might even have Carm join, because she's good. That is my beloved mother, the co-host of the show. Helen speaks the truth. STS, always very intelligent panel of guests. And here, this is the point I'm making. I was slipped a date R drug in college. I'm still traumatized 25 years later. I know that these accusers, a few of them are struggling day to day, and it happened years ago. Now, Ronald, back to you. There are additional charges, and I'm just curious how you think it complicates the case. There's victim 2, and in that case, I don't have the brother here, but it was a singular brother accused of sex trafficking victim 2, and then Tal separately faces sex trafficking woman victim 1. The first one for victim 2, I know it's confusing, like who's on first, but victim 2 is tied to Oren, victim 1 tied to Tal. These are separate charges of sex trafficking. How does all that work? I mean, in terms of the criminal case, I mean, it's got to be separated out. They deal with the most significant charges first.
Well, I want to give you a little a spoiler alert here, is the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
There's 2 words I'm going to say. It's called superseding indictment. So there's one of the negatives about doing a bail hearing is you galvanize the prosecution and the agents to like really focus on this case, because that's another problem. They become like the top of their desk. Not that in this type of case that this is probably their primary case, but it always happens. Like, you got to look at the workload, and now they all focus on this case. And now the more you keep it in the public eye with the bail hearings, the more victims, they say, maybe this is a good time for me to come forward, or I thought I slept with them and it was consensual, but maybe it wasn't. Like you have a lot of Monday morning stories that this is not like, this phenomenon is not unusual. But what was unusual again is you have 3 wealthy men that have never been told what to do before, and now they have a bunch of people telling them what to do, and they just figure. I mean, conventional wisdom is if your parents have $100 million, you're going to get out of jail. Like most people would think, I'm rich. I mean, like I got a plane access. I got all these things. It's hard for people to understand in the federal system. You don't really get out of jail. The judge even made a comment today about Madoff, which I thought was interesting. She said, this is not the Madoff security where, you have the nice older Jewish guy that ripped everybody off that's just going to sit in his house. And if he walks on the street, everyone pelts him. Remember when Madoff went out of the house one day and everyone was yelling at him, and he ran back in? And by the way, these type of cases are I would say more recent phenomenons. And you just have to recognize that you're not getting out of jail when there's WhatsApp messages, more than 6 women, and here you got allegedly 40. You're just not getting out of jail in the Southern District of New York. If this was in California, the bail, we don't have preventative detention there. It's not federal. The bail may have been $5 or $10 million, just like he got out in Florida. I mean, you're going to get out. So to address your question, not to get sidetracked, it's a waste of time to talk about, and that's why the judge was getting annoyed. They were only talking about the victims in the indictment, and the judge laid it out to him. I mean, you don't do that in New York. She's like, they're telling me about other victims. I mean, we all know what's going to happen because there's a Rule 6E. You can't talk about a grand jury. It's private. But everybody knows when they say there's other victims we've interviewed, you don't say the word superseding indictment, but everybody knows, the judge knows that it's all coming. So that's why federal law is not fair. It is not the same as state court. State court is like a Roman holiday. Everybody gets bail. You need a capital offense like with lying in wait in California.
Ronald, we haven't even talked about the acquitted conduct rule, where they could, if there are 40 women, they
42.
They could beat 41 counts and be convicted on one count. The judge can turn around, take the other 41 counts that they were acquitted on, and as long as the judge finds that there was a preponderance of the evidence that the criminal offense conduct took place with these 41 other women, the judge can figure the sentence based upon the other 41 women that they got acquittals on.
Wow.
The better strategy would have been when they got arrested to waive all detention hearings, get to New York quickly, and quietly get some well-connected people in New York. You get, like, I would say, someone like Randy or me that has a lot of street smarts. You may want to get a former assistant that kind of still has tethers in the office. I mean, they have enough money to bring on a good team, just so you kind of mix it up, have White Shoe, Street Fighter, get a couple people in there and start kind of softening this thing, and because litigating this publicly has been an unmitigated disaster, and you've rushed it to where you've rushed it thinking like it's a fair fight here, and it's not. It's like the scene in Alcatraz when Sean Connery is when they're going into the prison trying to break back in, and they have a better leverage, and they're all pointing at the Navy SEAL saying, "Don't come in," and then they shoot him in the shower. I mean, this is not a fair fight here. So the playing field is not equal. Like, that's what people, I don't know why criminal attorneys don't tell their clients, this is a very unequal playing field. We don't have any advantages yet. Like, it's silly. Federal court, it's stacked against the defendants. Randy probably remembers his favorite expression back when there was a lot of narcotics cases, when our clients, could speak fluent English, the law of the kilos. Okay, that was the first thing I learned as a young lawyer. If there's kilos involved, whatever you learned in law school, whatever you read in treason, it goes out the window. The judge is not going to reward your dope dealing client unless it's really clear. So when you learn, when you get arrested, don't make a lot of noise at first. Let things calm down. Get some documents together. And so that's why I wouldn't really waste your time on. They're gonna make it so painful. They're going to look at so many years in prison that the only smart play will be maybe a plea with no mandatory minimum if they would give it to them. Something like that. They're not going to go to trial on this case unless they like suicide missions. Because it'll be just like Maxwell. It'll just be like Epstein would have been. I mean, you can't win these trials. It's not like these are not county prosecutors. They have most of the goods already, and that electronic evidence is the worst, okay? It's the worst. The text messages and the emails, they've probably served subpoenas now everywhere, and then they go in with their crawlers, and you say a stupid email like, I slayed that so-and-so, and it comes back.
I have been on trial in the Southern District in sex trafficking cases, and you are sitting there while the jury is got up on the big screen and their own little computer screens, the text messages and the still photographs and the videos, and you're just looking for a place to run and hide, and you're just watching the jurors' faces, and you want to die.
By the way, I'm sorry to hear that, Randy, but I know you're savvy enough to at least wiggle your way out of some of that. But Ronald, to you, since you offered up the fact that your neighbor is none other than Sean Diddy Combs, people early on were asking, do you think, I mean, the Alexander brothers were in the Hamptons, are big time, connected to reality shows. You think the Alexander brothers, I know this is pure speculation unless you have inside information, but do you think the Alexander brothers and Mr. Diddy ever crossed paths?
Well, ever since I would say the late 90s, whenever I would go to New York in the summer, the key was to get invited to the white party that Diddy would throw in Long Island. I mean, contrary, to being objective, you didn't see anything overtly illegal at a party with 400 people where you had a guest list and you had to go. I mean, I would say there was a lot of people from New York wanting to get out to the Hamptons like they do all the time. It wasn't like some crazy, Looney Tune party, but it was like an event that you wanted to go to. But I don't necessarily think that they coordinated because each person that has a party doesn't normally like to share their list. Like I would say that it's not necessarily like a bunch of now people that are alleged perpetrators of sexual offenses all have these prior coordinations just because they're both from New York. I mean, these guys went to school in New York, but they're predominantly from where you are. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that Diddy had his own people that worked for him, that handled, that got his own drugs, that dealt with all this. But over time, every rich guy I've ever represented, they get delusional about their own place in the world. They get insulated with a lot of sycophants, and they just think like they become untouchable. And they think, the people that solve their problems, they think that they could solve these problems. And one day it just runs out. You can't solve the problem anymore. And it triggers an investigation. But nobody's prepared, no matter how rich you are, and Randy will agree, to suffer. Like, you cannot stop a Southern District of New York sex crimes investigation, no matter how much money you have. If there's real victims and there's real documented evidence of abuse, you're going to get arrested. Like, it doesn't matter.
I mean, they denied Diddy, they denied Epstein. So it's a definite problem for these guys.
And Maxell, Ghislaine Maxell, I thought she had a better chance, but they wouldn't let her out either.
Yeah. She's up in Tallahassee near Donna Adelson. Okay, so I got to get through a few more things here.
All right.
And General, to you, we talked about this briefly, but one of the questions just now, would one of the brothers potentially flip on the other brother? Just kind of pull back the curtain. When you're trying as a DA to get, and this is obviously a federal case, but when you're trying to get one defendant to turn on another defendant, how do you do that? I mean, you invite him into your office, give him a cup of coffee and say, hey, let's talk.
So typically you're going to be looking to try to flip a defendant into a witness when you don't have the strongest case. And one that comes to mind to me is the Holly Bobo case in Tennessee, Middle Tennessee. She was abducted, raped, and murdered. They did flip one of the co-defendants in that case. He became a star witness, but they needed to. They didn't have a very strong case without a co-defendant testifying, and he got a pretty generous plea offer, but it worked. So we do that, and so typically the way that would work is you're not going to invite the defendant into your office, but you are going to talk to defense counsel. You're going to hope that there's somebody like Ronald or Randy that we can talk to and deal with and talk turkey about what's your client's exposure, what is his liability here criminally, and what is in his best interest if he wants to become a cooperating witness. And you start those discussions. The defense lawyer is going to say, well, my client's looking at life, which he doesn't want to spend the rest of his life in prison. He doesn't really want to testify, but if you need him, how about 8 years at 100% or whatever the case may be? So that's kind of pulling back the curtain. I don't think that's likely here in this case. It sounds to me like the government has a very strong case against all three of these defendants who acted in concert over decades to abuse multiple women. I don't see the prosecution needing one of the brothers in this case. I don't think they're going to be willing to deal with one of these brothers. and cut them any kind of slack. So I think it's extremely unlikely that we will see a plea offer for one of these defendants.
Yeah, and as I said again, many of these victims, according to court documents filed by the SDNY, suggest that they are going to testify, and we're going to ask.
Well, but there is an interesting angle here, and this is something that happens probably more frequently in federal criminal practice than in state practice. But when you want to approach the government and you have the potential to cooperate, your potential as a cooperator is not limited to the four corners of this case. So, for example, yes, it might appear that the Alexanders have nothing to offer a prosecutor. They're going to offer up each other. That ship sailed. But let's say I am a real estate magnate in Miami, and I can go to a prosecutor and say, I can tell you about international money laundering. I can tell you about money coming in from all parts of the world, and people are buying up real estate in Miami. I can tell you about major drug cartels that launder their cash through buying real estate. It may very well be that because they're so well heeled and run in such high flying crowds, they might have information. Again, is that information that's going to get them a 37-month sentence? No, but it could be something that prevents them from getting 20, 30, or a 40-year sentence. So I would not be surprised to see one or more, or maybe all of the brothers, trying to make a deal, offering up cooperation on matters having nothing to do with this case.
I will tell you, there's an injunction from the Northern District of California that they entered in Florida recently, dealing with their real estate company that's a lien on all their assets. So expanding on what Randy said, these guys did hundreds of millions of dollars of deals, and they probably saw a lot of shady stuff, as we all see in deals, but we don't really, it's not our job to police every deal or look into things, especially if we're the lawyers. But as real estate agents, a lot of times they cut corners because they have different obligations, and there's no privilege for sure. So that is a great point, Randy. I mean, rather than arguing the facts, argue something else, because no one's going to get mad if they say, hey, I got a bunch of other crimes. I will tell you one thing I've done, Randy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's totally illegal. I've purchased 5K material. I've actually gone out to criminals and said, can you give me any crimes, because my guy cannot get out of jail, so they can get the credit for it, and we'll do this for you. And then we've, of course, disclosed the whole thing to the government that we're seeking 5K, and the government isn't really picky. If you tell them where crime is occurring and you want your client to get the credit, you can do that. It's not illegal or unethical. And so these guys maybe have to kind of think outside the box and say, are we going to win this case by fighting?
I don't think these guys need to think outside of the box. I think the circles that they ran in and the stuff that they've been exposed to, it would not surprise me in the least if someone has that moment of Jesus with them where, let's talk about what you're really faced with. What can you do to help us? It may very well be that they've got information on other people, all kinds of stuff that goes on where that might be their ticket out of a minimum mandatory sentence.
My only contra to that is politically, the new U.S. attorney may not want to let someone talk their way out of, sex crime victims. I mean, that's the problem, is that the crime is not typically, you can't cooperate. It's not like they aren't, other than the sex crimes, they're not financial criminals. It's not like in a drug organization where they want to go up the food chain, but we never know. I mean, there may be, as you pointed out, if they were in cahoots with Diddy and they were going to cooperate with some other sex trafficker, that would be a fertile area and they would be given that opportunity if they had, a like crime they can cooperate on.
Yeah. General Mark, on Passover, we've got the 4 questions, and that came up today in a slightly different context. It was revealed that a polygraph was administered preemptively before this hearing to Oren Alexander by a retired FBI agent, a guy named James Orr, O-R-R, out of Tampa. And he set up these 4 questions for Oren Alexander, to which he replied no to all of them. I'm going to read them real quick. Did you have sex with victim 2 when you knew she had been covertly given drugs? He said no. In New York, did you have sex with victim 2 when you knew she had been covertly given drugs? No. Did you have any kind of sex with victim 2 when you knew she had secretly been given drugs? No. In New York, did you have any kind of sex with victim 2 when you know she had secretly been given drugs? Almost the same questions, slight variations. The FBI agent says no significant reactions indicative of deception. Of course, he was hired by these guys. But what's interesting, the polygraph focused on one victim for Oren when there's 42 out there. We don't know if Alon and Tal were given polygraphs and failed miserably. How good or bad of an idea is it to present evidence from a polygraph at a bail hearing with one victim that he's being questioned on, with 4 questions that are essentially almost exactly the same?
Well, the judge didn't think very much of it, and they're not admissible in court. So, they just never been scientifically proven to be reliable enough to be admissible to put in front of a judge or a jury. And that's been true for decades now. And hiring your own private lie detector to focus on 4, 5 questions as it relates to one victim is just not going to move the needle. It did not move the needle with the judge. It's not coming into court as evidence ever. So, you can try that if you want. Some defense lawyers will volunteer their clients to take lie detectors. We've allowed that in a few much more minor cases, just to try to get some gauge of the credibility of the attorney and the client. But that's about it. We don't place much weight on it. And the judge didn't place any weight on it. I don't think the prosecution is going to either.
I agree. It's a gimmick.
Yeah.
The lie detector, sometimes I've submitted clients to the government and they administer it. At least then they don't get mad at their own results. But to just hire your own, it's just like, but they don't have, but you can't fault the lawyer. He threw in everything he could throw in, but again, he shouldn't have put himself in that hearing to begin with, because the probability of success was low. I mean, that's what I don't understand, why no one's talking to the lawyer, and saying, why are you doing this today? You could have waited till they at least got there. Well, I still, no one is, maybe you guys would know, what was the rush to do this hearing today? Why couldn't they waited 3 weeks till they got there?
Well, I'll tell you, I think it's because these guys can't handle being behind the bar. That's my personal opinion, and they're freaking out. But let me go through some facts here, because I want to get through this, and then we'll get some final thoughts. Now, all 3 brothers, according to the prosecutors, are accused. Listen to this: all 3 brothers are accused of the R word by at least 10 women. So all 3, each of the 3, at least 10 women have come forward. Over 40 accusers who say that they were forcibly R'd or SA'd by at least one of the Alexander brothers between 2002 2021. Again, the SDNY is saying that they use the word numerous victims expected to testify to corroborate all the evidence. There's electronic text messages. There's physical evidence. I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's R kits, semen. I don't know what it is. And then you've got documentary evidence to also be presented. And here's a quote, Randy, from the SDNY as we start to wrap this this episode up. The SDNY prosecutors, and I quote, "Moreover, the victims' accounts strongly corroborate each other, recounting similar experiences of sexual violence from the Alexander brothers, despite occurring in different settings, different states, and different decades. That's where there's a real problem. This isn't a pool of women or accusers that they're getting from a night at a club. This is 2 decades, multiple jurisdictions. So, I mean, that it's got to be a huge headache for you.
What the government appears to be setting up there is they're trying to backdoor the rule, which is we don't convict someone based upon what's called a propensity, meaning that if I stole this chapstick 2 years ago and I'm charged with stealing this mug, well, we'll introduce evidence that he stole the chapstick to prove that he stole the mug, because if he did it then, he must have done it now. We don't allow that. But what we do allow, where there is evidence, and I think what you're alluding to is a signature, something that a defendant does time and time again that is unique to the defendant, whether it's the defendant's calling card. So what it sounds like the government is setting up, well, we're going to be able to introduce evidence from other victims that are not victims as far as the charging instrument goes, to show a signature, to show a commonality in terms of motive or commonality in terms of the scheme. So we're not convicting on a propensity, we're convicting because there is a common link in the evidence. Sometimes we do that to prove identity, to prove a lack of mistake, but to get around this notion of we don't convict, you did it before, you must have done it now, but we do it because every single time Randy steals chapstick, he always says, I needed it because the doctor told me I have this whatever. And I say it every time the same way. Now that's my signature. That, I think, Joel, what you're alluding to is what the government is now kind of putting out there into the ether.
Yeah. So not dissimilar to what happened with Sean Diddy Combs, his homes in LA and Miami were raided at the same time. Well, when Tal Alexander was arrested in Miami on December 11th, the FBI was raiding his Manhattan apartment that he happened to share with Oren, which I don't fully get because guys are allegedly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a whole other story. This is where they say they found photos and videos. A direct quote here from the SDNY. In multiple videos, the women appear initially unaware that they are being recorded and become upset and attempted to hide or flee from the camera after realizing they're being filmed. Multiple other videos found in Tal Alexander's apartment depict Alon, Oren, and other men engaged in sexual contact with women who are visibly under the influence of alcohol or other substances. In some instances, at least one defendant, Alon or Oren, and another man physically manipulated the women's bodies in order to have sex with them, while the women did not actively participate in the sexual activity or they turned away. There are videos of Oren and Alon, quote unquote, engaging in sexual activity with at least one identified victim, meaning that they are in the act together, the brothers. So it just goes from bad to worse. The defense's response here, it was all consensual. That's what they say. It was a money play. It was all consensual. You got General Mark Davidson. He is the active district attorney for 5 rural counties in Tennessee, all around great guy. General Mark, how do you sum this up? I mean, let me ask you this. What is the best deal, the absolute best deal these guys you think could get? I mean,
I don't think the prosecution is going to offer them anything that they would accept. So I expect to see a trial in this case. And as soon as that evidence starts showing up in front of the jury, they're going to hate these guys. And it'll go downhill from there. In my opinion, there is no good defense to dozens of women making allegations that corroborate each other and are backed up by video evidence and trophy evidence with photographs and videos of them taking part in these acts with these disoriented incapacitated women, which anybody with any common sense can figure out by watching a video. I expect to see a trial and long prison terms for these defendants, and I don't expect to see a deal or plea offers from the prosecution that any of them will take.
Ronald Richards, first-time best guest. We're going to have him back on, obviously. Tenacious criminal defense attorney. You got to follow his Instagram page. He puts out all the documents on this case. It's attorney Ronald Richards, correct? On Instagram? Okay, there you go. By the way, Richard Clue, the attorney for Oren Alexander, said in court, he argued that pre-trial detention is meant for mafia bosses and cartel drug lords, not the Alexander brothers, who have pledged, quote unquote, any amount of money to secure bonds while paying for private security to watch over them at high-rise apartments in Miami. So it really should just be for mob bosses, I guess, and drug cartel lords, but I don't think that's going to be the case here. Ronald, your final thoughts, and I got to ask you, because Diddy is so high profile and there's so many similarities, it's going to make it even tougher for this defense, because you got jurors out there. Unless you're living under a rock, you have an idea what Diddy's been up to, and now you basically equate, well, these guys are wealthy, similar stuff. Your final thoughts on this, and what do you think is the best possible outcome for these three guys? I don't think a lot of people want that, but I'm curious what you think it is.
Well, I think Diddy's going to lose his bail motion in the Second Circuit, which will set the stage for them to lose their appeal if they appeal. But the best right now, the one, when I watch other lawyers do interviews on TV, the word quote, talking heads, because it's always, I'm always careful to not just be someone that just talks, because I know it's annoying when I have a lot of lawyers that follow me, and I don't like to do that because everyone knows, and Randy will tell you, and the general will tell you, if you haven't read the file, you're just kind of, you're doing the best you can with the evidence and the pleadings. I have read all the pleadings in this particular case, so I'm tracking it, so I have a better understanding of the government's position, the defense's position. But right now, when you say the best possible outcome, it would be premature to tell you that, because I truly believe there's going to be a superseding indictment. And I think if you remember Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein had his conviction reversed in New York State Court. A lot of that was because of the pattern evidence and the evidence of the, as my colleague was talking about, the prior acts that weren't charged. I think what prosecutors learn from that is charge every victim that's willing to come forward, and then you avoid all that. Then you got a real victim and a real charge. Then you don't have to worry about the 404B evidence, the propensity evidence. So what I'm saying is, it would be irresponsible for me to tell you what the outcome is going to be, because some cases become so horrific that the outcome is they're going to do 30 years in prison. That's going to be the outcome. However, a great disposition for them would be, and when I used to represent a lot of gang members that I knew in the Torrance area, because I just, not every gang member is a bad person, but I just had an affinity with some of them. They would get unlawfully swept in by over broad LAPD sweeps. They would always say to me, "Hey, Mr. Richards, just get me a date. I need a date." Like, that was the expression, because in California, everything was 25 years to life in the 90s and early 2000s before we started, whittling down the third strikes law a little bit. And a lot of times, in federal, there is no parole. You don't get good time. So these guys need a realistic assessment. I mean, they got young kids, newborns, something where they get between, they are first offenders. They don't have a prior criminal history. That's good. But they got to try to be realistic and say there's going to be between a 12 to 18-year sentence here that is possibly doable, where you get, a year off for the drug program, maybe some other reduction. And then at least you have a life still. I mean, there's a big difference between getting out of jail when you're in your late 40s and late 60s. I mean, and unfortunately, sometimes you get into so much trouble that you just have to understand that you have to mitigate. Do you want to have a life still? And like, they have to be realistic, but at least if you talk to the prosecutor as their lawyer and say, listen, I mean, I'm looking for an 11 to 18 year range. I think they're not going to fall off their chair. You're not talking silly now to the prosecutor, because there is some benefit for them getting the sure win, saving the victims, the testimony, and at least you're not coming at them with something stupid like, I want to talk about a 4-year sentence. It's like, that's how you lose sort of credibility with the other side. So I'm saying in this particular case, that's what I would say would be a good outcome. But I know it's going to happen here. These guys are never going to take that outcome, because I've had clients like this. Another lawyer will be more liberal in their prognosis, and they will pretend that a trial in the Southern District is a completely fair trial and everything's fair and everybody likes you. Okay. And you're innocent until proven guilty. Like, that means a lot. Like, you come into the courthouse and you get a free shirt that says, I'm innocent. And all the jurors say, you know what, that guy's innocent until I prove it. Where the real answer is, you're sitting there with 3 other guys, and they hear they in the voir dire, they talk about, are you going to get upset if you hear 20 women talk about how they were R'd and S'd and all this other stuff? And right there, the jurors say, that guy's probably guilty. And then you're going to be convincing them that there's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the real world, not this magical, everyone's innocent until proven guilty. So they have to realize that in federal court, in that courthouse, and Randy, I think, what is the statistic? 98% conviction rate. I mean, like, the 9 federal not guilties I've won in my career, I post them on my wall. That's how excited I am. It's like a miracle. It's like winning a suppression motion. It's like the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life as a lawyer. When, they come back with the verdict, it's going to be a guilty because you couldn't figure out a way to get your client out of this, couldn't negotiate, and they say not guilty, and you're like, oh my God. And you just hear the shackles break. And then you walk out of court, and it's really real. You get to walk out, unless they're there with another indictment and they arrest your client. But I'm saying that's what they got to do, in this case, is have a realistic outcome. Otherwise, it's just going to be a disaster. Like, Bankman-Fried, he went to trial. I mean, you know all the cases in New York. They all lose. You're not going to win those cases. I mean, the fraud cases lose. The sex crimes cases lose. The drug deal, the guy from El Chapo lost. I mean, all these cases are losers. Can you even name one case? I really challenge, what case have they won in the Southern District in the last 10 years? A rich person on a high profile case where there's multiple victims, unlimited evidence? None. There's no case that anybody could think of. Smaller cases win, where there's, a little bit of a overcharge, or no one's watching it and they don't put on the A team, they put on the B+ team. But not like this, where everyone wants to make their career off this case and then work in a 5-star law firm. I mean, you got to understand what's going on here.
By the way, Ronald, if I didn't know better, I would think you're from New York City. You got the New York City energy. If you appreciate the content on the show, hit like, please subscribe. We've got a Patreon page that really goes a long way in supporting the channel, where the COE puts a lot of material we discuss into the Patreon page. Randy Zellin is an absolute mensch. He comes on. I'd be terrified to know what he would charge me for an hour and 38 minutes of his time. Luckily, he's doing this pro bono. DOJ and SEC. He's tried cases against both. He's on TV. He's a professor at Cornell. Randy, accusers on the stand. You're going to see women up there who are crying, who are reliving horrific memories, and you're going to see a lot of them. How do you get around that with a jury of your peers?
Well, I think that's why you're not going to see any of them testify, because I think what you're going to see is a global resolution, all 3 brothers' cases resolved. I think one of them will go in to cooperate. All 3 of them will get credit for the cooperation, and they will look to avoid the bottom end of the 180 months, and certainly going up as high as life. But Joel, yes, in those moments where you have to cross-examine a vulnerable victim, whether it is a child or it is a woman who is the victim of a sex crime or the victim of sex trafficking, unless you can clearly establish that the accuser is lying, unless you can clearly establish that the accuser has a financial incentive to tell something other than what actually happened, what you want to do is you want to get that vulnerable victim off the stand as quickly as you can. In fact, sometimes you don't cross-examine the victim at all. And if you do, you limit it to, again, just floating that weather balloon up for the jury that maybe this person has an economic incentive, has some other incentive to be less than truthful. But the longer you're up there with that vulnerable victim, you are digging your client's own grave.
Two very quick questions, Randy. How soon could a superseding indictment come down and an arraignment? They have not been arraigned in New York. When should we expect that?
A superseding indictment could come down tomorrow. It could come down next week. And there could be another superseding indictment after that. I'm guessing that the brothers are probably, and forgive me because at the onset of the show, I made it sound like they were already in New York. Unfortunately for them, when they end up in New York, they're going to be at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where Diddy is. And believe me, they'd rather be in Florida than be at the MDC. So they'll probably try to stay in Florida for as long as humanly possible, but they will end up here. They will end up in Brooklyn. They will not have an easy time of it. It is not a fun place to be. And there may be superseding indictments until either they cry uncle and they look to resolve the case or there's a trial date set.
One last question, Randy. How much time are these three guys going to spend behind bars? 30, 45?
No,
life?
I don't believe so. As I said, I do believe that they're going to resolve the case. And I think they're probably going to be looking at a sentence, in my mind, somewhere south of 180 months if they really want to resolve the case, or maybe at that 180-month mark. So this way they're 37, 38 years old. They do get 15% off good time a year. So maybe they get to see their kids bar and bat mitzvah.
I'll tell you this. If they did commit these crimes, personally, I don't think they should get out, but that's one man's opinion. We're going to continue to cover this case. We're going to get psychologists on next week to go inside the minds of these brothers. Why would people from such privilege, success, good looks, the whole deal, why break bad, as they say? Huge thanks to the STS best guests, Ronald, Mark, Randy, and I always say best guest, better community. Love you, STS Nation. We're back tomorrow night, by the way, with an LA case. David Pierce on trial right now, PEARCE, for the overdose death of two women in Los Angeles who are left at a hospital to die. We're going to have Josh Ritter. He's connected professionally to the case. That's tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you then. Love you, America. Love you, New York City. Love you, Tennessee. Love you, California. Los Angeles. Stay strong. And we will see you on the flip side. Guys, stick around if you can for 1 second.